Hey there, wire weavers. Today we're going to be talking about making these simple Mobius rosettes that you see in the center of this earring here. I started out making chainmail jewelry, so you can see this handmade chain here and the rosettes. I decided to update these earrings and turn them into sort of a wire jewelry basics workshop. So this is what the updated version is going to look like. We're going to make these earrings soon, but before we do that, I'm just going to show you how to make these Mobius rosettes in this quick video here. And we'll make these from scratch, so we're going to make our own jump rings and then we're going to assemble the rosettes. So to make your own jump rings, you're only going to need a few simple items. So we're going to use 18 gauge wire. This is dead soft 18 gauge wire. And you'll need about 13 inches, which will make about 12 rings. And then you're going to need a 6.5 millimeter mandrel of some sort. I'm using a 6.5 millimeter knitting needle. And knitting needles make really great mandrels for making jump rings and for just general jewelry work. I use them for making bails and lots of other things. So if you happen to have knitting needles laying around, these are really great tools for jewelry making. If you have a 1/4 inch dowel, wood dowel, that'll work. And then the other tool that is ideal is a pair of super flush cutters. Now if you don't have super flush cutters, you can also use just regular jewelry cutters. You can see these are my old wire cutters and they're not super flush. They do leave a little bit of a chisel tip on the cut end. You can use these and a needle file to get by. Okay, so I'm starting with about 13 inches of 18 gauge wire, dead soft wire, and my 6.5 millimeter mandrel. And all we're going to do is carefully coil this wire around the mandrel. So I always start, this is just a habit for me, I always start any kind of coiling that I do with the wire behind the mandrel or behind the base wire or whatever it is I'm wrapping. And then I'm just going to bring that around and begin coiling. And you want to coil this as tightly and as neatly as you can. So I tend to just roll my mandrel and keep my thumb pressed tight against the mandrel and just wrap those coils as close together as you possibly can. This wire is pretty springy. It doesn't want to coil super tightly. But we're just going to keep carefully coiling until we coil that whole piece of wire. And notice as I do this, my tail end that I started with is I'm also coiling that. And that's just, I like to use as much wire as I possibly can. I want to be conservative and not have a huge amount of waste. So I tend to make my coils pretty tight, and I coil as much of the wire as I possibly can so that there's very little waste at the end. So we're just going to keep on rolling, and there we go. It's a pretty nice, neat coil. Now if you have nylon jaw pliers at this point, you can go ahead and kind of force those ends to conform to your mandrel, and then you can really utilize as much of this wire as possible. Get as many rings out of it as you can. Now you only need 6 rings for a pair of earrings. We're going to do 3 per rosette. But you'll get about 12 rings out of this if you plan it just right and if you use as much of your wire as you possibly can. So here's my coil, and as you can see, it's pretty neat. It's pretty tight. I don't have too much gap. There's a couple of pieces there where there's a little bit of a gap. That's okay. Now if you look here at this end, you can see that this was cut with the inside of my flush cutters. It has that sharp bevel point there. So the first thing we want to do is trim that off. So I'm just going to separate this coil a little bit with my thumbnail. I just want to separate it enough that I can get my cutters in there. And the trick here is you want to keep your cutters as close to perpendicular to the wire as possible. If you cut at any sort of angle, that's going to show up in your rings. When you close the rings, you're not going to have a nice neat closure. So try to keep these nice and square so that you get a nice flush cut. And I'm just going to trim off that little piece there. And now you can see I have a nice square cut. Can you see that? See how nice and square that is? And if you look on this other end, this also has, you can see that chisel tip. So we're looking for the nice square flush end. That's what we want on these rings so that they'll close neatly together. So that's the start of our first ring. Now we're going to separate this just a little bit. Try not to push it too much because you'll distort your rings. And now we want to cut this one square as well. We're going to situate our wire cutters so that this cut end is flush with the top of our cutters. And that's going to make sure that this is a true 6.5 millimeter ring. If I go one way either direction, it's going to, if I go this way, move my cutters this way, we're going to end up with a ring that's smaller. And if I move it the other way, we're going to end up with a ring that's slightly larger. So I just want to get that lined up nice and neatly right there, and then go ahead and cut. And now we've got our first ring, and you can see, let's see if we can get a close look at this. See how nice and flush that is? So this is going to give us a pretty clean closure. Now these flush cutters, they're super flush cutters, they're an expensive cutter, and they do a really good job, but you can see they leave just the tiniest little lip there where the wire is pinched off. And that's just the nature of handmade rings. These are going to be about as good as I can achieve by hand. Now, one thing I could do to improve the quality of these rings is I could cut all of my rings and then put them in my tumbler for several hours, and that would help clean some of that up. It would burnish those ends a little bit and smooth them off. But that's not really necessary for this. We don't need these to be absolutely perfect. I'm just showing you how to make jump rings, you know, a smaller number of jump rings to do something simple. If you need a lot of jump rings, then I highly suggest buying machine cut jump rings, which are going to be much higher quality. And I'll link to a couple of sources in the description for places where you can get some good quality machine made rings. But for now, this is just a skill-based tutorial. I just want to show you how to make some simple jump rings. This is a good exercise in precision. So we're just going to go ahead and continue doing the same thing. Now this one is going to have a chisel end again, right? Because we use the other surface of the cut on the finished jump ring. So for every cut that you make when you cut apart your rings, you're going to have to trim off this chisel point on the next ring. So we'll just cut that off, and remember, you always want the flush end of your cutters facing the finished end of your wire. So this is going to be one end of our next jump ring, so we want that nice flush cut there. And then I'm going to make a little space there so I can get my wire cutters in. And again, we're going to line up right next to that cut end. See, that's nice and flush with the top of my cutters. And again, make sure that you're cutting squarely across the wire. I cut just a little bit of an angle on that first cut, so this ring is not going to have a super clean closure because those rings are not cut perfectly perpendicular to the wire. But again, that's okay. We're just learning a new skill here. We're not, you know, we're not trying to meet the quality of machine-made rings because, frankly, that's just not possible to do by hand. So I trimmed off that chisel tip, and then again, line that, you know, set that end flush with your cutters, and trim the other end of your ring. So that's 3 rings, and I'm just going to keep continuing this until I have gotten all the rings out of this coil that I can. And then this is going to be our last ring here. So again, I'm going to square off that end, and then I'm going to line up my cutters with the top of that, or the flush end of that ring, and we ended up with just a partial ring there. So let's see, we got 13 rings out of that. So that worked out pretty well. You'll get about 1 ring per inch, so use that to estimate how much wire you want to use to make your rings. And again, you'll just need 6 rings per pair of earrings, so 3 rings per Mobius rose. So we made our jump rings. Now we want to go ahead and assemble them into the pretty little rosettes that we're going to use as decorative elements in our earrings. So to do this, you're going to need 2 pairs of pliers. I'm using 2 pairs of flat nose pliers here, but you can use a pair of flat nose and a pair of chain nose if that's what you have, or bent nose pliers, whatever your favorite pliers are, go ahead and use those. And the thing I like about chainmail is it teaches you really fine hand control, which is really useful for making jewelry. You want to have good control of your pliers, your tools, and there's nothing quite like closing a jump ring to test your fine motor skills. So here's the way that you close rings neatly. You want to overlap just slightly. Can you see how those 2 ends are slightly overlapped there? And I'm going to do this a couple of times. And what I'm doing is I'm creating some tension in the ring. I'm work hardening it and I'm creating tension. So when I line those ends up, they're going to press tightly up against one another, and see how nice and neat that closure is? That's what we're after. So by slightly overlapping that, what we're doing is we're creating some tension so that this ring wants to be smaller than it really is. So that when we put those 2 ends together, they're going to press tightly up against one another. And that gives you a nice, neat, professional closure. See how clean that is? Okay, so we're going to do the same thing on this next ring. We're just going to loop that closed ring onto our next ring. I'll show you this again. So slightly overlap, and you'll hear your rings clicking as you do this, and you want to hear that clicking sound. That's telling you that your ring is making good contact with those ends. And if you feel like your closure isn't quite tight enough, you can do it again. Just keep working it a little bit, and then boom, they'll tighten right up. Now you can see this one doesn't have quite as neat a closure, and that's because I didn't cut that very straight. Those ends are cut at a slight angle, and if you look at the ring behind it, it's a little bit cleaner join because I cut those ends straighter. And that's part of the trick of cutting your own rings. Now, if you buy machine-made rings, they're always going to look beautiful. They're always going to have nice square ends. But when you cut your own rings, you know, there's just a certain degree of flaw that you just kind of have to be willing to accept. So let's go ahead and finish this rosette. We're going to thread these rings onto our next open ring. And again, we're going to overlap once, twice, 3 times. Close nice and neatly. And then you just want to make sure that all your rings are rotated the same direction and that they kind of nest neatly together. And you can put them on the surface and use the tips of your pliers to kind of get them to settle down into a nice, neat nest. So there you go. This rosette is ready to use in our earrings. Now that you understand the basics of how to make rings and also how to assemble the rosettes, let's talk about what you can do if you don't have super flush cutters. So these are my old wire cutters that I've had for many, many years. This is what I started out with when I was making chainmail. And I still use these cutters quite often. But the problem with these is, do you see this little groove here? That's going to create a little bit of a chisel tip on the end of your cut. Can you see that little peak there? Now, wire cutters don't actually cut wire, they pinch it off. And the wire will take the shape of whatever it is that's pinching it. So this groove here is what creates that little chisel tip that you see right there. Now, if you look at my super flush cutters, these are perfectly flat. So that's why I get that nice, perfectly flat cut. But if you don't have super flush cutters, and this is an expensive tool, so I don't necessarily recommend that everybody run out and buy some. If you're really committed to making wire jewelry and you know that you're going to be getting some years of use out of these tools, then yes, go ahead and invest in a nice pair of super flush cutters. But if you're a beginner and you're not even quite sure yet if wire jewelry is your jam, then you can start with an inexpensive pair of jewelry cutters just like this. And I'm going to show you how to compensate for that little chisel tip that we get there. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use our needle file to take down that chisel tip there. So I'm just going to very gently smooth that off. And I don't want to take a lot of wire off, I just want to take off that little tip. So just a few strokes, and you can see now that that's pretty flat. It's not perfectly round, that's okay. What we want is just a nice, reasonably square, flat tip. And now that we've got that, we're going to go ahead and cut the other end of our ring. And this is where you have to compensate a little bit for the fact that you don't have super flush cutters. So I'm going to spread these wires apart just a little bit so I can get my cutters in there, the tip of my cutters. Now when we were cutting with our super flush cutters, we wanted that tip flush with the surface of our cutters. In this case, you want that tip sitting just slightly above the surface. And that's because we're going to pinch off and we're going to create that little ridge, and then we're going to file that off. So in order to make sure that our ring is at least 6.5 millimeters, we want to add just the tiniest bit of length there. You see where my cutters are positioned? So now when I cut this ring off, and I have that sharp little ridge there, see that? Now when I take that down, that's going to hopefully be just flush with that other cut. Do you see how I did that? So now let's file that ridge off and try to do this as straight as you can. I'm going to open that just a little bit. You want to keep this as straight and flat as you possibly can. There we go. That looks pretty good. We smoothed off that rough edge there. And now I'm just going to close this ring and let's see what we've got. So again, we're just going to do the same closure technique. So we want just that little bit of overlap. 1, 2, 3, and close. And that actually looks pretty good. Now this isn't going to be as nice a closure, as neat a closure as we were able to achieve with our super flush cutters. And that's just because we filed those ends and it's really difficult to get that perfectly flat. So this isn't a perfect join. Let's compare it to one of our rosettes that we made earlier. Let's see if I can find a join here. There we go. So see, that's not quite as clean, and that join's not perfect either because that one, the wire wasn't cut perfectly straight. Let's look at another one. Find the join here. There we go. This one's a little straighter. So that was a pretty straight flush cut there with our flush cutters. And look how much cleaner that join is compared to the one we just made. But that's totally okay. This is perfectly acceptable. This ring here is perfectly acceptable for handmade jewelry. And it saves you about $70, $80. That's how much a good pair of super flush cutters is going to cost you. So again, if you're not ready to commit to jewelry full time, you don't really love making wire jewelry, then maybe you don't need to invest in an expensive pair of super flush cutters. And you can totally get by with using just regular, inexpensive wire cutters that come in a set. These pliers here all came in a set. It was a 4-piece set. There was round nose, chain nose, actually 5 pieces, round nose, chain nose, flat nose, wire cutters, and bent nose, which I don't use. My bent nose are packed away somewhere because I just don't even like using them. But this was an inexpensive set. I think the whole set cost around $40. So I got 5 pairs of pliers for less than I paid for my 1 pair of super flush cutters. And like I say, this is perfectly acceptable. This will make a pretty rosette. And by the time you get that rosette assembled, you're not really even going to notice those joins there. I hope you enjoyed this quick tutorial. Like I said, next week we're going to work on this earring, and this is sort of a whole workshop in a single project. We're going to form symmetrically shaped earring frames. I'll show you my trick for doing that. We'll flatten wire, we'll hammer texture wire. I'll show you this binding technique. We'll make some open loops and closed loops, and these closed loop connectors. I'll show you some strategies for assembling pieces that use closed loop connectors, because that gets a little tricky sometimes. So be sure to come back next week and we'll make some earrings. Until next time, wire weavers, go make something beautiful.